Everyone, and thank you very much for joining us and for sticking around for our presentation. We're gathered here on unceded Kanen'kehá:ka territory and recognize our responsibility to acknowledge and respect Indigenous lands that we discuss today. Today we'll be presenting on mobilizing flood adaptation solutions in Canada, but we also acknowledge that currently in Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, they're facing devastating flood impacts. While climate impacts are global, today we focus on Canada.
We'll present our topic in 5 sections. We'll introduce the topic and present the background. Then we will briefly present the key insights to mobilizing flooding adaptation we identified in our research. The core of our presentation will be our 8 recommendations. And finally, we will conclude and welcome your questions. Our policy challenge was to develop recommendations that the insurance sector could take to mobilize climate adaptation in Canada. We focus on flooding adaptation because floods take lives. They disproportionately affect vulnerable populations. They disrupt the economic activity and are the costliest disasters in Canada. Canada is warming 2 times faster than the rest of the world. The country is facing rising sea levels, loss of snow and ice, and increased extreme rainfalls. In November, flooding in British Columbia displaced more than 15,000 people, and the cost of rebuilding are estimated at $9 billion. These floods are not 1 in 100 years events. Rather, they are increasing in severity and in frequency. Flood damage costs covered by the insurance sector in Canada have increased by 4 times in the last decade. While flood adaptation solutions exist, their adoption by governments across Canada has been slow. For example, in some municipalities, flood maps have not been updated in 20 years. For these reasons, mobilizing government action on flood adaptation is crucial. As part of our research, we conducted a literature review and stakeholder interviews to understand the barriers to mobilizing climate adaptation. As a result, these are the key insights driving our recommendations. I'll provide a brief summary. The first one is capacity. There is a significant capacity gap between governments. For instance, small municipalities and Indigenous communities often don't have the capacity to develop their own flood risk maps. A recurring theme was funding. Our research revealed that the municipalities must jump through multiple hoops to get provincial or federal funding, which often discourages them from applying in the first place. Next, there is also a lack of coordination among levels of government that impedes action. Municipal and provincial stakeholders expect the federal level to take greater leadership. Our fourth theme is political will. Political leaders don't want to spend funds on preparedness because there is little pressure from an electorate that perceives spending on recovery as a political success. Let's talk about awareness. An explanation for the lack of public pressure on politicians is the public lacks awareness about where flooding impacts are occurring, what the risks are, and what the cost would be if a flood occurs. Our sixth theme is flood mapping. According to our research, there is no comprehensive public data on flood risk in Canada. At least 500,000 buildings at risk are not identified by government-produced flood maps. Finally, there is a lack of region-specific top-down criteria from the federal government for implementing natural infrastructure. In designing these recommendations, we prioritize the ideas that tackle several barriers at the same time, and we focused on the federal government because they are best suited to lead on adaptation, and they open a policy window to advocate for change. In May, the government published a discussion paper that recognizes the urgent need for adaptation action. We believe the timing for our recommendations is perfect.
Great, so from these key insights on the barriers, we've developed 8 main recommendations and divided them into 3 sections. Keep an eye on the 3 icons that identify the sections of our recommendations. The first section is to raise awareness of flood risk. The second is to increase capacity for flood adaptation. And the third is to accelerate actions for flood mitigation. Starting with Section A, raising awareness of flood risk. Most Canadians are not aware of their flood risk. From the general public to the public sector to the private sector, there's a lack of understanding of flood risk. The federal government identified that 2 in 10 Canadian homes are at risk of flooding. Yet, among those affected, only 6% living in flood-prone areas knew the risk they faced. according to a survey by the University of Waterloo. To begin with recommendation 1, update flood maps. In Canada, some flood maps are missing or 20 years out of date. This recommendation is directed to Natural Resources Canada, which oversees flood mapping. We propose 3 main components to the recommendation. The first component is a flood map portal that would allow residents to search their vulnerability by postal code. The federal government has already promised to update flood maps, so they can collaborate on developing this portal with the insurance sector and Indigenous nations who have experience developing flood maps. Greater access to flood maps will help residents understand their flood risk and take necessary precautions. The second is informational resources, like videos and summaries that can equip homeowners, renters, real estate agents, and lenders to make informed decisions and better mitigate future flood risk. And finally, to understand flood vulnerability, NRCan can overlay flood risk maps with socioeconomic status of residents of Canada. Our research identified that Black, Indigenous, and poorer communities are disproportionately impacted by floods in Canada. A focus on high-risk flood areas would help establish and identify and address the vulnerability of marginalized people.
So our next recommendation is to develop a centralized dashboard integrating all the adaptation initiatives across Canada. There are various adaptation initiatives, but those are not detailed or disconnected. However, through this dashboard, we identified a window of opportunity for interactive learning, sharing best practices, and strengthening the collective voice of public and private actors towards climate actions. The insurance sector needs to advocate for a centralized adaptation dashboard to Natural Resource Canada since it has the reason and capacity to do so. The dashboard will come with multiple benefits we have outlined in the report, but we will be discussing a few here. Firstly, about network governance. So the dashboard is expected to initiate a network governance. It will enable the public sector actor to analyze best practices and adaptation initiatives in other jurisdictions. For example, they can filter through budget, timeline, risk level, required expertise, and many more variables. We are envisioning that these will enable governments to make informed decisions and take incremental policy approaches. This means making small and constant policy improvements after evaluating the needs of different municipalities. Next, flood map integration. So currently, climate conversation is rotating around greenhouse gas emission, and adaptation dashboard will give more prominence to flood. This is because flood is one of the most expensive weather events in Canada. Once flood maps are integrated into this dashboard, the dashboard will provide more information about the needs of public servants for faster actions. For example, comparing location-specific risk data with flood protection initiative of neighboring municipalities can bring more clarity of strategizing implementation for a given municipality. This dashboard will act as a guiding tool for flood adaptation and thereby lead towards faster action. And finally, how will it benefit the insurance sector? The insurance sector is constrained to cover people for flood risk in absence of effective information. The dashboard will inform insurance sector about initiatives in specific locations. Then the insurance sector can tailor its products based on local preparedness and ask for fair premiums from its clients. These will also enable them to be more efficient on overall risk transferability for flood damages. Moving on to your next recommendation, the recommendation here, we propose the insurance sector to organize hackathons in partnership with top Canadian universities. The hackathon will bring the country's best app developers together to design virtual reality-based flood experience app. Combining innovative ideas into a master app can help raise awareness through VR platforms. Later, the insurance sector should advocate Natural Resource Canada to initiate forward and popularize these apps across Canada. The current approach about awareness, the current approach tools such as disseminating pamphlets, social media campaign, and classroom teachings are not effective in influencing actions. Many residents in Canada have not experienced extreme flood in their lifetime. There's a need of experience-based awareness of flood events for better actions. Why virtual reality? Canada's booming technology sector is perfectly equipped for implementing awareness through virtual reality. We identify virtual reality of a simulated disaster can motivate people to take measures. Researchers found that people gain increased risk perception and negative emotion through a simulated flooding experience. Participants who experience flood through virtual reality invested significantly more in risk reduction than the control group. Some countries are already using VR for public awareness. We can take example of Japan. Japan is using VR for flood disaster preparedness. VR-based kiosks can target the groups with limited knowledge about VR. And finally, how it benefits multiple sectors who will be attracted to take this initiative forward. We can give example of the gaming industry. The gaming industry is already addressing sustainable development challenges by designing games on real-life problems. Increasing use of VR for flood experience will provide the opportunity for the industry to design flood-focused VR games, which will lead to further awareness among the Canadian youth.
In the previous section, we discussed how raising awareness would mobilize adaptation actions. Now, I'll give you a brief overview of the capacity problems addressed by the two recommendations in this section. Lack of capacity is a key barrier to mobilizing flood adaptation in Canada. But what do we mean by capacity? Capacity is the ability of public servants to use available climate adaptation tools and incorporate an adaptation lens in their day-to-day work. Despite some progress, Canada still lags in building adaptation expertise among its public servants. Upon further investigation, we found more than 50% of the adaptation specialists consider their lack of expertise as a barrier to incorporating adaptation in their work. This finding has also been validated by most of the stakeholders we interviewed. Federal officials are not aligned in their understanding of what climate adaptation is and what are the effective flood adaptation solutions out there. At the provincial level, there are not enough experts who can identify local adaptation needs. Smaller municipalities and indigenous nations do not have the capacity to prioritize climate adaptation or even apply for federal funding. They need to go through a complex web of application processes to access funding, while large municipalities have the capacity to fulfill these technical requirements. Smaller ones lack the capacity. Now, this results in low usage of funds. The Office of the Auditor General of Canada reported that over half of federal flood mitigation funds were unutilized during the fiscal year 2009 to 2016. Moving on to our next recommendation. Now that we understand why adaptation capacity building is needed, we believe the first step towards that is to conduct a capacity needs assessment. This will give a stock take of the existing skills and capabilities. The assessment will segment public servants into 4 categories based on their influence in adaptation planning and their level of capacity. The primary recipients of the training should be public servants with low capacity. Personnel with high capacity will help develop an organizational ecosystem, learning ecosystem. Based on our research, we found 2 overarching training methods that might work best for adaptation-related training. The first one is short-term training, often more desirable and readily observable. Research showed that short-term adaptation-related training is most effective when customized to the participants' needs and tailored using context-specific examples. The second one is continuous learning, where staff with low capacity would be matched with the champions and influencers identified through the needs assessment for facilitating peer-to-peer learning. This would complement the short-term training and will give public servants the opportunity to enhance their adaptation skills and knowledge on an ongoing basis. Lastly, there's a window of opportunity as the Building Regional Adaptation Capacity and Expertise, which is called BRACE program, led by Natural Resources Canada, is scheduled to phase out this year. This program provides funding for training and knowledge exchange activities on climate adaptation. However, the effectiveness of the program has had mixed reactions. Training is mostly done on a project basis by external agencies, and there's no coordination on the contents. Take-up of the training has also been very low. This further creates the need for a new program. So far, we have discussed about individual capacity building and why it is important, but we must not forget about the structural challenges to mobilizing action. This recommendation addresses a systemic barrier to accessing funding for local adaptation-related initiatives. We recommend the insurance sector advocate for developing a one-stop shop platform to manage all the federal adaptation funding programs. Currently, the funding programs are highly fragmented, which stems from the diffusion of responsibilities. There are at least 5 ministries working in the adaptation space, and each has several funding programs. This makes it harder for municipalities and indigenous nations to identify the suitable funding programs and apply. Developing a single platform to manage these programs could mitigate these issues. The proposed platform should be a website designed in a phased approach. The website would initially be informational, offering details about compliance with the program requirements. When all departments or federal departments are on board, it could take a coordination model and gradually incorporate provincial and private sector grants and contributions. We recommend conducting a feasibility study before developing the platform. Also, a mapping exercise can help identify an exhaustive list of available programs. We see Natural Resources Canada is best positioned to develop and manage this platform, considering its mandate of advancing the climate adaptation agenda in Canada. It also has a large portfolio of funding programs under its belt. The one-stop shop would reduce regulatory and administrative burdens. From an economic perspective, the primary rationale for introducing the proposed platform should be to achieve allocative efficiency via reduced transaction costs for local governments. Lastly, Canada already has experience in developing similar platforms like Service Canada. It is not a new concept to the federal government.
Thank you, Mansoor. So we've now transitioned from raising awareness to increasing capacity, and finally now to accelerating actions. In Section C, we look at different ways to accelerate government action to protect Canadians. We know that 1 in 10 homes in Canada are uninsurable due to flood risk, according to the Insurance Bureau of Canada. Residents of Canada are not adequately covered by flood insurance, and homeowners and renters face the greatest burden during and after floods. We've identified ways to reduce this burden. For example, preserving wetlands can reduce flood damage costs by up to 40%, and we'll get into that. Also, according to our research, the current evaluation framework is impeding government action on climate adaptation. We suggest the next recommendations for accelerating actions. So recommendation 6 is to update a national flood insurance program, and this recommendation is directed to Public Safety Canada. A lack of government coordination across Canada has created a patchwork of flood insurance and left people behind, unprepared, and uninsured. Canada is the only G7 country with no national flood insurance program. The current government's election platform committed to developing a national flood insurance, but their promised program requires stronger regulation. The insurance sector should advocate for the following regulations to the Federal Task Force on Flood Insurance and Relocation. The first is a mandatory flood risk disclosure. There's currently a moral hazard issue where real estate agents and lenders are not obligated to share flood risk information when selling a home. A mandatory disclosure would ensure that all potential renters and home buyers have the information they need to make informed decisions, including flood history, past flood damage, and future risks. A default opt-out program would encourage greater flood insurance coverage, as less people are motivated to opt out of the program than to opt in. Automatic enrollment is especially critical for those within high-risk flood areas where insurers cannot cover them. And the development of new housing in high-risk areas must be regulated and avoided. Then, the final component is collaboration for greater coverage between Public Safety Canada, working with the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, CMHC, to conduct outreach and communicate flood risks for homeowners. These regulations will ensure a much stronger national flood insurance program that would protect Canadians in especially high-risk areas.
Thank you, Caroline. We recommend a shift in the adaptation evaluation framework. Public servants have limited time and energy, and they will prioritize tasks that are attached to clear assessment and recognition of their work. If the evaluation framework is unclear or doesn't adequately reflect progress on climate adaptation, government action will remain slow. According to our stakeholders, that is the case. Contrary to mitigation, there is no benchmark determining what is successful adaptation. Building a baseline is difficult because vulnerability constantly changes. Successful adaptation actions may prevent events from causing damage and taking lives, but saved lives and avoided damages are hard to measure. To remove these barriers, we recommend the insurance sector propose a shift in the evaluation framework to the government. This would move from an emphasis on cost effectiveness to a more comprehensive perspective based on learning for adapting. We believe the right theory to develop the framework is utilization-focused evaluation. It fits the highly uncertain and constantly changing context of climate adaptation. Applying the theory enables public servants and other relevant stakeholders to participate in the development of evaluation questions, objectives, and indicators. That way, the evaluation will be meaningful to their work, and with their buy-in, this framework will increase the use of evaluation results. A federal entity should provide the evaluation framework to be applied nationally and macro indicators for comparison, while allowing context-specific indicators to be developed locally. For example, the government could track readiness by measuring resources devoted to flood adaptation according to local budgets. We believe that with this shift in the evaluation framework, public servants will have useful and meaningful feedback of their climate adaptation actions. Funding processes with the federal government will be easier since they won't rely on data that is very hard to provide. And the National Adaptation Strategy discussion paper identifies a need for a different evaluation approach, which presents an opportunity for advocating for this change. Now I'll pass it on to Caroline for a final recommendation.
So our final and 8th recommendation is to invest and partner for natural infrastructure. Thanks. Nature is an effective first line of defense from flooding. Natural infrastructure is currently underfunded, lacks region-specific criteria for implementation, and lacks meaningful partners with Indigenous peoples. We recommend the following components to Environment and Climate Change Canada and Infrastructure Canada. The first is investments in pilot projects. These projects would include restoring wetlands and marshes, and in urban areas, installing green roofs and rain gardens. These wetlands can act as sponges to absorb water and to defend homes from floods. Investments can help divert floodwaters from gray infrastructure like sewage systems to green infrastructure like wetlands. Setting criteria for co-benefits is our second component. Natural infrastructure can serve double duty. It can act as both climate mitigation, as in carbon sequestration, and climate adaptation through flood protection. Municipalities have indicated a lack of context-specific criteria that recognizes these co-benefits from the government's programs. These best practices can help avoid malpractices, often called maladaptation, and violations of the land rights of Indigenous peoples. And so third, partnering with Indigenous peoples. Since these projects take place on Indigenous land, building meaningful relationships between federal government and Indigenous nations is essential. The government can work towards its reconciliation and UNDRIP commitments, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, as well as Indigenous people having been stewarding this land for millennia and have important traditional knowledge. Partnerships would ensure greater longevity of the natural infrastructure. Now I'll pass it to Shabir to conclude.
Let's recap the key points to conclude. Raising awareness is the first step to protecting residents from climate adversities. In general, Canadians are unaware of their flood risks. Within the next 5 years, centralized mapping and visualization effort can address the knowledge gap. Capacity is the key driver. Despite some effort of increasing capacity, smaller municipalities and indigenous governments are not adequately equipped. Increasing capacity through training programs and simplified funding processes can help mobilize action. within next 2 years, designing an evaluation framework in tune with the evolving nature of climate adaptation can motivate public servants to implement solutions. Regulations for National Flood Insurance Program and investing more on infrastructure can enhance the flood resilience of the vulnerable population. We started working on these issues in November 2021 when British Columbia was devastated with flood. The frequency of these events are increasing faster than the government is reacting to this. So in a nutshell, Canada's insurance sector can advocate to the federal government to raise awareness, increase capacity, and take adaptation actions outlined in our presentation. Together, they can contribute to saving lives, protecting infrastructure, and improving the well-being of current and future generations. Thank you so much.
Okay, folks, thank you very much. This team wins the Time Management Award because they have left 4 minutes on the clock. 4 minutes. What are we going to do with all that time? Okay, first to the judges. Leslie, you're up.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your presentation and the report. Nicely done. I guess that my first question, you might think it's going to be about evaluation, but it's not, is actually about feasibility. And so you have this variety of recommendations, and a lot of them really are the insurance sector advocating for somebody else to kind of take this on, right? So I'm really curious, like, which of these recommendations do you feel are most feasible to actually implement, in kind of coupling that with impact, right? So which could be most impactful and feasible?
I'll take care of this question, and thanks for asking it. I think this is exactly the type of question we were asking ourselves about which one would we tackle first, which one serves as a foundation to the other recommendations. And so we started with the flood risk maps. That was our first recommendation because it does act as the information necessary for many of our other recommendations mentioned, like the adaptation dashboard, the hackathon, the natural infrastructure projects, for example, and understanding the vulnerability of certain Canadians. And once we have that information, since those maps are currently outdated, 20 years we've mentioned, having that as a first priority was clear, but we know government's already working on it. And so we haven't seen these updated maps yet, but so we've provided some guidance about how they can do it better once they do implement it. We've also checked, kind of validated that finding with our sponsors and with the insurance sector as well. We've identified that their top 3 priorities are the flood maps, as mentioned, and then a national flood insurance program was the second priority, and then natural infrastructure projects. And these are ones that are either underway or already invested in, and we see in our recommendations ways that they can improve on that. So stronger regulations or stronger criteria, setting parameters for how to do it best.
Thanks. Mm-hmm. Okay, my second question is about evaluation. Don't want to let you down. And I'm really happy to see a recommendation around it, of course. So I'm curious why you picked utilization-focused evaluation as the theory of interest here instead of something that really hits head-on the inequities issue that you raised early on. There are lots of other ways to do evaluation, lots of other frameworks to think about. So why UFE and not something else that hits that specifically?
Yeah, so we heard from the stakeholders we interviewed that the current evaluation framework was impeding their learning from the adaptation actions that they were taking. So we prioritize utilization-focused evaluation because currently the evaluation framework is not serving public servants to adequately do their jobs. And also, I think with utilization-focused evaluation, we included a process that we didn't present today, but it is in our report. And an important step of the evaluation process is consulting several stakeholders. And of course, and also we included in our recommendation that during this process, indigenous communities and poorer communities should be consulted to develop the indicators and the objectives and the evaluation questions that are more relevant to them. So we thought that with this theory, we were addressing both issues at the same time.
Okay, fair enough.
All right.
Nadine.
Thank you so much for your presentation. As someone who lives in a very flood-prone city, Lagos, for the last 3 days, it's been nonstop rain, and we're swimming. I actually swam to the airports, if you can believe it. So this is a very real issue. But as I was listening to you, I was thinking about the segmentation of actors and who has the most influence. And when you talk about, the insurance sector has a role, government has a role, citizens have a role, right? And so I would really like you to pinpoint, let's just pick the government. How are you segmenting the role of the local government versus the provincial versus the federal? Because in climate adaptation and flood mitigation, they all have critical roles. So that's the first question. The second one is, I didn't see a lot of international best practice benchmarking. And for me, that's so critical. If you look at a city like Amsterdam, they've done a fantastic job with flood mitigation. There are many other cities and many other parts of the world that we can learn from to kind of make an argument and fast track work here. And I'm wondering whether you looked at that and which parts of the world inspired some of your ideas.
Great. Maybe I can tackle the first one. So as we were thinking about our recommendations and consulting stakeholders and a literature review process, we thought about which, and actually I think it was also a question our sponsor had in our initial mandate, which level of government should we prioritize? And so we spent some time thinking about that. In the literature review, we discovered a gap on understanding the governance on climate adaptation. So there wasn't much on how the governance architecture, the relationship between municipal and provincial and federal and so on, was impeding climate adaptation. And so we focused on that governance architecture. And then we decided also to focus on the federal government because we consulted stakeholders across all levels of government, and they all seem to require more leadership from the federal government and acknowledge that they needed top-down criteria for advancing climate adaptation, which I guess isn't usual for other issues, but in the case of climate adaptation, a stronger leadership from the federal government was demanded. And also we try to devise recommendation that take care, that sort of clean house, but at the same time allow for municipalities to do their thing and for provincial governments to do their thing. Because we figured the main issue was on governance, and the federal government should be prioritized.
If I can add to Juan's question answer, so basically flood doesn't have any specific jurisdiction. An event, climatic event like flood, it crosses other jurisdictions as well. So that's why there is a coordination problem. Municipalities don't know what to do, how to coordinate with other municipalities or even provinces. That's why most of the stakeholders said federal government should take a leadership approach in bringing everyone together to, yeah.
And I could tackle the second question, which was about international examples. So Shabir gave the example of Japan for the VR technology, the virtual realities, simulating what flood risks look like. And I'll point to 3 other examples. We looked at the Netherlands, as you mentioned. Having a country below sea level rise is an incredible example of how do you mitigate flood risks. And in most of our stakeholder interviews, the Netherlands rose to the top as the example of international leadership on this. They have diking system. They have an approach even looking at it as sponge cities. So seeing how do you embrace water as part of the architecture and urban planning of the city. But then we also looked at the US as an example for the National Flood Insurance Program through the FEMA, because they are able to identify the risk of of those in most high-risk flood areas and distribute national flood insurance in that way. So that was an example there. We also looked at specifically Philadelphia because they are recognized for doing really interesting work on nature-based solutions, natural infrastructure, looking at incorporating rain gardens, diverting waters from sewage systems towards green infrastructure, as mentioned. So that was one of the case studies that we included in our report. And then I'm thinking of one other international example in our report, and they've got kind of a little box called case studies, but this one's the UK, where we looked at the flood mapping in the UK, and they have a system where you can search by postal code your own flood risk, and you can also sign up for early warning systems and get access to information about flood risk too. So we recommended a few of those components in our recommendations.
Natalie, your turn for a question, or are you going to take us to sponsors?
No. Oh, and I think we're going to stay probably mostly in the room. So if people in the room have questions.
So do we have no sponsors online?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. We'll ask, but I don't think so. Okay. My question goes to something you said about the Auditor General's report of the 56% of funds for flood mitigation had not been used between 2009 and 2016. Which I thought was shocking. At the same time, sometimes we hear the federal government, public servants of the federal government, define their role as kind of the national ATM for funding projects. And so what I'm guessing is behind that 56%, programs that had been defined for which they either did not receive enough applications for or enough qualified applications for, and so the money went unused. So my question is around this topic. One, is the money still there? And two, can we use the projects for natural infrastructure, which I thought are really interesting, to be funded by these funds that are apparently not being used?
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually. So just to move back a bit, so lack of funding has been one of the key barriers. I mean, we heard that across all these stakeholders that there's a lack of funding. But when we delved deeper, we found that actually it's not even a problem. The problem is the application process. It's extremely complex, and the local governments, the indigenous nations, and the smaller municipalities, they don't have the capacity to fulfill all those technical criteria. And that's why the applications are, the usage of funds are very low. That's why. And yes, those funds are available. But what was your second question? I'm sorry.
If the natural infrastructure projects could apply for that type of funding.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Actually, this was mentioned by one of our stakeholders that if there's any remaining funds available out there, we can make another funding program actually for the natural resources, natural infrastructures. So those unused funds could be diverted to natural infrastructure projects.
Okay. I think I will ask a question.
Sure, and there are no questions online right now. So if anybody
Okay.
has any questions online, we're asking them to raise their hand, and then we will unmute them. But aside from that,
Okay, so
you can
while
ask
everybody
away, or-
behind the judges' table thinks about your question, in fact, I'm going to go to Brian first. The rest of you can think about a question, and then I'll do that. I'll do mine. No, you're first, Brian.
Okay, well, maybe what I'm going to do is invite you to respond to a reflection, okay? So I guess about 6 years ago now, I spent about a month in a warehouse with a whole bunch of Canadian military, Alberta firefighting, police, and all sorts of other folks. Here he's nodding his head. While we watched this incredible fire come within an inch of burning down Fort McMurray. And it was an absolutely unbelievable volcano of fire that was generating its own weather, that was shooting out lightning bolts to start new fires, to perpetuate itself. And it kept roaring around the city. It was really, really something. And the people who worked on that crisis all had memories of working together when the Bow flooded in southern Alberta and put his hometown under a foot or so of water, along with High River and a whole bunch of other places. All this to say, floods and fires are becoming overwhelmingly gigantic challenges. And you basically have two public policy choices. You can either undertake heroic measures to deal with them. So, for example, after the Fort Mac fire, a lot of the firemen in their postmortem said, there are cities and towns all across Canada in the boreal forest that are all at risk of having the same experience as Fort McMurray did. And what has to happen is the federal government proactively, as a plan, not waiting for applications, needs to cut down the forest around all of these communities, at least 2 and preferably 5 kilometers away from the city. It's a gigantic job. Or you need to deal with flood mitigation on your topic, similar to the spillway in Winnipeg, in which you re-engineer the waterway. And failing that, you have to get out of the way, which means get out of the fire and get out of the plains. And so I guess my question is this. After all these capacity steps have been taken, what do you think needs to be done to deal with these challenges? Because what you've alluded to setting the scene, but then there's the action. So what do you think needs doing to adapt to these challenges?
I think you illustrate a really beautiful example of many different climate impacts that we could expect. And climate change is not going away. In fact, it's getting worse and accelerating, as we've mentioned. The flooding impacts in particular are ones that we are not proposing to necessarily stop. We're trying to find ways to adapt to them. And so that's why you might have noticed in our report, we didn't mention relocation, because in the context of the insurance sector, we're trying to figure out how do we protect those who are most at risk proactively. Because relocation is not a sustainable solution. We know that Canada is going to be, and this is a little bit out of scope, but I'll answer in that sense, Canada will be welcoming migrants due to climate impacts around the world. And we need to figure out how, as a country, do we respond to these increased events? And how do we protect those who are most vulnerable right now before we have to resort to relocation? So I think that's a really good question. And it's something that we also need to recognize that we have to adapt, but the first step is also mitigation, and they have to come hand in hand. We also have this challenge of continuing as a country to produce greenhouse gas emissions, which the other team tackled, and we need to figure out how do we reduce our climate impacts so that we don't have to adapt as much. I hope that gives a general response.
Raul.
So people can hear you online.
I have a question about the natural infrastructure piece that you guys brought up, and this is just my very limited understanding, right? Like, the natural infrastructure solutions are there, and there's a lot of evidence that shows that they work. But I'm wondering, what in your research have you found to be the principal barrier to why governments, or just in general, why are we not doing more of that? I understand that, and you might correct me if I'm wrong, like, there's tension in terms of, like, okay, if you talk about the green economy, you solar plants and like thousands of jobs and like the transition, whereas if you do natural infrastructure, maybe you have like people protecting the wetlands, but the amount of jobs that you might be able to create are not necessarily as much. So how do you manage like those tensions, and how do you overcome the barrier towards natural infrastructure?
Okay, I'll also jump on that one since it was my recommendation that I presented. But the natural infrastructure is not a silver bullet. I was saying that it serves double duty for climate adaptation and climate mitigation, but there also are some real risks of doing it wrong. And we have to be careful in certain examples. The government, for example, of Canada committed to planting 2 billion trees. It was one of their campaign election promises, and reforestation has a really important role. But nature-based solutions, what the government is invested in, also have the risk of monoculture, of afforestation, which means planting trees where they weren't originally there before, which could reduce their effectiveness. And if these trees do not plant, if they don't last long, there's the risk that they could emit more emissions. So you have to consider biodiversity science, you have to consider Indigenous knowledge of how where nature should be protected. And it's a combination of these things. And of course, partnerships with Indigenous people is the first step. It's happening on land and unceded lands and needs to ensure consent and stewardship together. So I think there are a few components to that, and in international climate conversation, it's gaining more and more prominence, and so it needs to be treaded carefully, but has real potential.
Natalie.
We have a question from online. Andrew is joining us. So Andrew, share your question.
Hi, everyone. Great to be able to join. I'm actually calling from my house here in Val-des-Monts, which I bought 2 years ago. It's on a lake. Before I bought this house, I studied very closely the flood mapping that the province of Quebec had put in place, and I was really looking to understand better the policy context under which all of these maps have been produced, of course, after disasters and flooding disasters that required that they be put in. I wanted to get back to the earlier discussion around governance, because I think it's a very interesting topic that, in my community, for example, we do have local programs that are put in place to incentivize natural solutions to flooding to protect our lakes. So I sort of see it on a very local level. But given what you've explained about the challenges in being able to, for communities to be able to, and partners to be able to access this financing, that would seem to be an argument for devolving down a lot of the solutions and not having necessarily the federal government lead, and given the real diversity of challenges from rural to urban and otherwise. So as you were talking to partners, and I wanted to just give you a bit more opportunity to explain how you did come to the conclusion that there needs to be necessarily a federal lead on this particular issue, and how that can really be simplified and to really be able to produce a national policy, given the vast diversity of the challenges that communities face. Thank you.
No, thank you, Andrew. So that, again, was one of the challenges that we thought about designing our recommendations, because Canada is, of course, very diverse geographically, and the climate impacts are very different across regions. But again, both because the stakeholders interview were directing us towards that direction, and because when we were conducting our literature review, also we discovered that there were both vertical coordination and horizontal coordination issues. So lack of communication and clarity of functions between different levels of government, tasks where different levels of government overlapped, and the fact that the municipal and provincial stakeholders that we consulted were just demanding for more clarity, were the reasons that we decided to focus on the federal government. But I don't think, but at the same time, our recommendations allow for municipalities to continue with, for instance, policies around land zoning, and so it's not like the federal, through our recommendations, the federal government will step into the toes of different jurisdictions. I think the direction we went to was more about cleaning house first, and that's where we chose to focus on the federal government.
So I'd like to come back to things that Brian and John said. This idea that you're focusing here on, or part of your recommendation is focusing on better flood insurance rather than relocation. And I want to mention two different types of relocation conceptually. So Brian made reference to the Winnipeg or the Manitoba spillway. So you probably don't know what that was. In the 1950s, a man named Duff Roblin was the premier of Manitoba. And what happens in Winnipeg is it's fed from the Red River that comes up through North Dakota into Manitoba, and it floods a lot. And then it goes into Lake Winnipeg, right past my house, north of Gimli, okay? But the Red River floods, and when the Red River floods, it's a serious problem in northern North Dakota and southern Manitoba. Duff Roblin had a vision, which was, let's dig a big ditch that will then move the water when it's flooding around Winnipeg. So he didn't relocate the people, he relocated the water. And everybody made fun of Duff Roblin, and they called it Duff's Ditch. I encourage you, now since that time, I'm not sure exactly when it was finished, but it would have been late 50s, early 60s. And since that time, it has saved Winnipeg several times, hundreds probably of billions of dollars worth of damage by simply taking the water, putting it into a ditch, not all of the water, just the overflow, into a ditch that went around, for 30 miles, went around the city of Winnipeg. I encourage you to take a look, Google Maps, and take a look. You will detect it. It's the only thing that is very clearly a river that is man-made shape, okay? So that's relocating the water at great expense, but it has massively paid off as an investment. What John was talking about was relocating people. So rather than actually provide better insurance, you do the one-time upfront cost of just buying people out, and you relocate them, and you basically avoid the problem, at least for those people that relocated. So I guess my question is, why a clear focus on better insurance rather than avoiding the need or reducing the need for insurance by getting people out of the way, either getting the water out of the way or getting the people out of the way? I guess that's my question. And if I could just, throw in the little education about Duff's Ditch, that's just a little Manitoba lore. You have a...
Can I add a sentence to that? Or a couple of sentences?
Sure. I'll take it as a friendly amendment. I'm just in anticipation that it's a friendly amendment.
Not move very many of the people out of the way. But in the neighborhood I described in Point Gatineau, there were obviously some people who were well equipped to fight a flood. I mean, they were young, they were strong, they had extensive networks of friends and family. They had access to, high clearance vehicles and, trailers, and they had money, and they could fight the flood. They could mount an effective defense like my friend did. And there were old people living alone who had no ability to fight the flood. Well, you would only move the people who had the lowest ability to fight the flood, but move them at a time of their choosing before the flood arrives and in a way that's sort of planned, right, instead of just basically flooding them out of their homes and never bringing them back. The armed forces takes you out one day and you never see the place again, which is kind of what happened to the oldest people.
Just to address your question, so we have thought about both, whether relocation is kind of important or making natural infrastructure or waterways just to avoid that relocation. It really depends on the context, because the thing is it depends on what is the cost of relocation and what is the cost of paving another way for that water body or whatnot. So we have thought about this problem, and then particularly US and FEMA is having this problem when you have this flood insurance in place and relocation is not happening, so increasing flood events is costing government more and more. Why not the government could create something that is kind of save that community? But it's an investment question, and that's why we have talked about improved flood maps that kind of give the accurate idea. We have talked about the dashboard that can say what costs and implications for the other jurisdictions who has done that, whether the municipalities or the provinces has that capacity or not. So you can always, you have that cost constraint and then expertise constraint, but you can always see whether you can meet that and can go there. But it's a very context dependent question that you can always borrow policy from other provinces and can paste here, and it will work effectively. It really depends.
If I can just add another idea to that as well, our sponsor was the insurance sector, and so we did find that our focus was mostly on insurance. But that said, the diverting of rivers is an idea of a solution. But we did look at floods more extensively than river flooding too. We looked at fluvial, participation being a big one. Pluvial is how it's called, and so we wanted to have a holistic holistic perspective and looking specifically from the insurance angle. And so we found that our stakeholders, especially from the insurance sector, were really pushing this national flood insurance as a kind of a federal backstop for how do we currently, for those who are on the front lines of floods, how do we ensure that they are not left behind? And we saw that as the most crucial first step. Yeah.
Nadidi.
I just wanted to make one last point just on this governance issue. To buttress what I think Andrew, who was on the screen?
Yes, Andrew. Yep.
Andrew, and what I had said earlier. When I reread the report now, you even get down to names of people in federal government, like talk to Chris and get him to change this. And I don't know about Canada, but when government shifts, it's not just an individual you're influencing, it's a system. And so how do you make that trade-off between targeting Chris and saying, get Chris to get more snacks in Max Bell versus get Max Bell to understand.
More snacks? Is that what it is? More snacks?
I'm just using that.
More snacks for
I'm
tomorrow.
just using that as an example versus let's get, institutional, change here. Beyond Chris, there are other stakeholders who might, if he's an appointed person, will stay shorter and be replaced depending on how the political wind moves. How did you kind of weigh that in your assessment?
I can take that question. So first thing, when we were kind of looking at the power and authority, which department can mobilize these recommendations. So we also determined who has the ultimate power to take decisions as well for that particular department. So our recommendation is zoomed into a person who is currently in the office, but definitely in our recommendation, if you have noticed, we have talked about the institutions who can take it forward. And then the person who is taking the lead of that institution is going to be the one who is going to be responsible for taking it forward later on. So it's just to give a bit clarity and specificity, but it can still be working the same way given the department we have identified.
And if I can add to Shabir, and if you look at our action plan, most of our all the 8 recommendations are short term, basically within 0 to 2 years advocating. So considering that time scale, so it's better to name them, be as much specific as possible. So we try to do that.
Okay. Anything else from anybody? All right. Well, thank you very much, folks. Well done.